So it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Stern. And Sam has been at Newbridge for just over 2 years. And he has graciously agreed to give this residence present today. The title of his talk is "To Forgive Could Be Human, to Forget is ?" Sam was born in Fürth, Germany, near Nuremberg. And he today is going to tell us about the story of his family and their survival of the Holocaust. And this is a wrenching story, and we really appreciate his being willing to share this with us. When Sam finally got to the United States in 1947, he grew up in the States, and then he went on through high school and then entered university. He obtained his master's degree in biophysics at Johns Hopkins, and he received his PhD in marine zoology at the University of Miami. He's conducted research in broad-reaching areas, and he published papers which included macromolecular studies of the sea urchin egg jelly, changes in the chemical composition of pre-implantation mouse embryos, and deposition of tooth enamel in human teeth. He had faculty appointments sequentially at Johns Hopkins, at Harvard, and then at Boston University. And he had real pleasure when he joined the faculty at Boston University of presenting science to students whose interests were in anything but science. And he then became an administrator at Boston University and finally retired as a professor emeritus in 2002. I'd now like to hand over to Sam, who will make his presentation to us.
Michael, thank you very much for an introduction, most of which probably belongs to someone else. But I am here today, and I'm going to read some things, which is something I rarely do. It'll be just as we start and then at the end. So let me read, and then we'll move forward. Since April 15th, 1945, I have required myself to speak of my incarceration in concentration camps, ghettos, and a prison. However, the immediate impetus for today's event began on January 26, 2020, at a Newbridge brunch. The 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz was mentioned, and I realized that this year also marks the 75th anniversary of my liberation from Bergen-Belsen. My mother, brother, and I were, after more than 3 years of slave labor, set free by British soldiers. My father could not join us. I plan to focus on my 1939 through 1947 family, but my presence today would not have been possible without Doris, my wife, Alan, my son, Laurie, his wife, and their issue, triplets Reuben, Jeremy, and Celia, my favorite grandchildren, and Charlotte, my loving companion. So I will, if I understand how to do this, move to share screen. You should be viewing a rather lovely, colorful picture. This is a picture postcard, and you can actually see the crease where the postcard was bent at one time or another. It's of Nuremberg, Germany. And I will talk primarily through the eyes and situation of Nuremberg, even though there are some other towns in the neighborhood of Nuremberg, but I'm going to ignore them. It's, I think, going to make life a little easier. There will be a presentation of my family, 2 uncles, my mother, my father, my brother, and my stepfather. Each of whom, except for my mother, brother, and I, had totally different experiences during and because of the Holocaust. So this particular image is a very popular one of Nuremberg, which was and probably still is a city that does not favor any Jewish residents. Indeed, between the latter half of the 17th and the middle of the 19th century, Nuremberg did not allow for any Jews to be citizens of the city. Soon after the roughly 1850s, Jews started settling in Nuremberg, and in 1933, there was a rather large number of Jews, large in relation to the overall population of Nuremberg, of approximately 9,000. In 1941, which is the year my family was shipped away, there was a total of 1,800 Jews, all of whom were sent to various concentration camps. Of the 1,800, approximately 100 people returned. My brother, mother, father, and I were sent to Riga, this will come up again, on the 29th of November, 1941. Of the 512 people who were on that train, 16 returned. My brother and I were the only children who returned from that. Now, this particular view, which certainly was painted prior to the First World War, it's really quite a lovely place. And Charlotte and I had the privilege of seeing this view in 2011 when my brother and I returned to Nuremberg for the observation of the 70th anniversary of the shipment of Jews from Nuremberg, specifically to Riga, the capital of Latvia. Amazing. After the war, this structure was not present. It had been completely bombed out. And I should mention that this particular dome, and you can see a slight bit of gold up there, on top of that was a Star of David. This was a synagogue. It was among the first synagogues burnt on Kristallnacht. I don't know what its function is today, but I'm glad that it was restored. I'm going to talk about several people, as I mentioned before, and also an issue of names. And let me go to the first thing of interest to me. My name is Samuel Stern. I was born in 1939. My brother Peter was named Peter Gunther Stern. My parents had very little choice of what to name me. The number of names available for newborn Jewish children was really limited. And the name Samuel was chosen for me by my uncle Martin, who was not called Martin Israel Uhlfelder at the time of his birth. Israel was a name that men had to adopt to show that they were Jewish. That is part of the Nuremberg laws. And you can see that my father also adopted Israel, but others don't have it. Incidentally, the names that I will deal with are such for which I have complete documentation. So you will see some documents that clearly say Martin Israel or Arthur Israel. My uncle was born in 1916, and I am sure that you'll remember there was a war going on, and the Kaiser of Germany was named Wilhelm. So what else would you name a male child born during the war? Wilhelm, by the time he was 17, in 1933, realized there was no future for Jews in Germany. And on his own, he emigrated to the United States, joined a family of cousins in Atlanta, Georgia. And Willie then moved to Florida, West Palm Beach, where he was a successful businessman and I think, really beloved member of the community, and it also included his presidency of the Reformed Synagogue. Martin had a different fate. This is my Uncle Martin. This is my grandfather on my mother's side. This is a magazine published in Erlangen, right near Nuremberg, and it's the history of the Erlangen Jewish community during the Nazi era. In 1980, I traveled with my uncle, my wife, and our son to Erlangen. And the day before we arrived, a roll of film, exposed negatives, was found in front of Town Hall. No one knows where it came from, but one of the pictures on there was this one. My grandfather, my uncle, they were being marched to the synagogue where their picture was going to be taken. And this is the day after Kristallnacht. My uncle came up from Nuremberg to see if he could help his parents. My uncle decided quite early, as did Willie, that there was no future for anyone Jewish in Germany. So he planned his getaway. In order to receive a passport, he had to have clearance from people who knew him, and in particular from the rabbi, the chief rabbi of Nuremberg. And the German here says that he was a good person, and since he was going to England, would would not be a problem in the United kingdom. Also important on here is his address, which is from Nuremberg, and it's Marienstraße 1, number 1 Marienstraße, and it's signed by the rabbi. Another document of his, dated the 10th of August, 1939, and you can see the swastika, is a release by the Nuremberg police showing that he was a good person. He had reported, as he had to as a Jew, to the police on a monthly basis, and that apparently there were no charges against him, and he would just be a reasonable person to emigrate anywhere. Well, he did get a passport. And like other passports for Jews at that time, it had to be stamped with this letter J. And I have other documents from him with that letter J. You can see his name, Martin Israel Ulfelder, and he is not accompanied by his wife or any children. Well, he did have a wife and did have a child. They refused, well, his wife refused to leave Germany. Her ultimate fate was that she died in a concentration camp, as did my uncle's son. This is the last page of his passport. The most interesting thing about that is the date, 30th of August, 1939, that he arrived in Dover, in Great Britain. You will remember, of course, that on September 1st, Germany attacked Poland. This clearly says that he had to report to the police and so forth on, which he did by the 12th of September, 1939. And he was incarcerated in a camp on the Isle of Man, along with other refugees. Then he was sent to Canada, where he worked to pay for his stay, was released from any kind of responsibility and duty in 1943. He met his future wife, they married, and had a very nice life together. This is now where I come in. My father, my mother, my brother, and an individual who had the same weight problem years ago. The picture was taken sometime in 1940. I don't know when. My father had owned his own automobile garage, which he had to sell in 1938. And he was forced to become a teacher of young Jewish men to learn how to wind generators for cars. In theory, this was so that these young men could find jobs. I am sorry for this, what might be a confusing map of Europe. On November 29th, 1941, 1,000 Jews from the Bavarian area of Germany were put on a train to be sent to Riga, the capital of Latvia. It is a distance of about 700 miles. The adults who were on the train had to pay the fare for that trip. It was not built up in any way or reduced. It was the standard fare for a second-class ride from Nuremberg to Riga. They could take only one piece of luggage each, and the number of children was not counted. Back in 2011, when Charlotte and I visited Nuremberg, we saw the area where the train left. You can see here around the area of Riga a rather dark death head and the word Rumbla. This was one of the places of a very large massacre of Jews, similar to what would be here, Babi Yar. There were more than 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto who were executed the day before we arrived in Riga. Also, as I found out, a speech someone made, there had been 3,000 Jews who were moved from Berlin to Riga the week before that, and they were also shot in that time period. There was a concentration camp here. It was being built, called Jungfernhof, and it was certainly not finished in time to accept the number of people who were transported there. Here we come to what I think is the only reason that I'm able to be here today, and that is my father's ability to work with electrical equipment and the setup of electrical structures. He and those boys that I spoke about, his students, were required to wire the camp so that it could be inhabited. We were also living in the camp, no enclosures, and then moved to the ghetto, which was in Riga. I cannot in any way explain why this was done, save for the fact that my father was a well-trained and profitable slave. We were in Riga for a period of time. Now, that sounds terrible, a period of time, but that's the best I can do. I don't have documentation on the dates we were moved and other things like that, so a period of time. And then moved to a most unlikely place, right here in Russia, very close to the German-Russian front. There was a ghetto here in a town by the name of Pskov. And again, my father was used as a mechanic for the German cars. My brother and I often test each other in terms of what do you remember and what do you remember? We rarely differ. And in terms of important events, we remember them pretty much the same way. But here is the first difference that I remember. With my father working on the cars, my brother and I am now 4 and he is 7, jumped into the cab of a half-track, started the engine. I was in the well of the truck dealing with the clutch. And he had the wheel. Now, the best thing that could have happened was that the car stalled. And it did. I didn't release the clutch very well. And we received a heck of a beating for that. You will remember, of course, that the invasion of Russia by Germany was doomed, fortunately, to failure. And the Russian front, the pink here, started moving closer and closer to Pskov. And while we were there was actually an attack. And for some reason or another, my father was involved in one attack, and as a result of something that he did, a senior German officer did not die. Again, something incredibly important. With the full retreat of the German army from the advancing Soviet army, we were sent back to Riga. Why this happened, I have no idea. But we were not sent to the ghetto, nor were we sent to any of the concentration camps. We were sent to jail. Much of this I know because of the writings of my mother, conversations I had with her, conversations I had with uncles, and another person you will meet very quickly. The jail is something I remember with unfortunate great clarity. We were locked in one room for a period of 6 to 8 weeks. And when we were let out of that room, my brother's hair had turned completely white. We were then put on trial. My father, as a result of the trial, was sent to Buchenwald, the concentration camp, which is over here. My mother, brother, and I were sent to a different concentration camp, one called Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück is not generally on the list of the worst concentration camp that one can find. It was a terrible, terrible place. There's a book written for children about a young British woman being sent to Ravensbrück. The title of the book, and I must look, which now, of course, I cannot find. The author is Weil, W-E-I-L, and the title of the book is Rose Under Fire. When I read the book, I cried, because the author had done sufficient research, spoken, I guess, to a large number of people. She described the physical structure of the camp just the way I remember it. And it was a most peculiar camp for women, political prisoner, and a camp for medical experimentation. Many of the women prisoners underwent operations which removed bones from their body. And the question asked of the experiment was, how well did they survive? Not well. For us, the fortunate part was there was a hospital. My brother and I were terribly ill We had boils all over our bodies. And what I remember really with one boil on my heel is that I had to walk on the toes of my right foot. But nevertheless, we were hospitalized, treated as we would have been in any hospital. We got out. Ravensbrück had, well, let me get to something later. Let me do something first, and that is introduce to you my stepfather. My father died in Buchenwald. I will show you his death certificate in just a moment. My stepfather was born in Nuremberg, and after the German-Soviet Mutual Non-Aggression Pact was signed, there was a shifting of people. They were declared to be Polish, Russian, or German if they were living in the area of the Soviet Union. They were sent to Germany and vice versa. So my stepfather was sent to this town, in which there was a ghetto. That's what the Star of David indicates. And it was a border town, depending on whatever war was going on in Europe and whoever owned certain territory. It was called either Lemberg or Lvov. When he was there, it was called Lvov and was drafted into the Soviet army. He served in the Soviet army from 1941 to 1945. When we were in Ravensbrück, we had to wear numbers. Ravensbrück had uniforms. There was no tattooing. And this particular number was worn by either my mother, brother, or me. I don't know. But like many of the things that I own and that have been distributed primarily to my son, my mother kept everything. So there are other artifacts that we have, and they're really, they bring tears to my eyes. In Ravensbrück, in a statement of Nazi efficiency, and in the mail system that was part of the concentration camps, we received a copy of my father's death certificate. He was born on the 29th of August in 1907. He died on the 30th of May in 1944. We obviously, after we separated at Riga, never saw each other again. Let me back up a little bit. I'm sorry. In the late winter of 1944, with the advance of the Soviet army, Germans started emptying concentration camps. Often they would let people out, no food or anything, to just go wherever they wanted, or were shipped from one place to another for some purpose. So we were to be sent from Ravensbrück to Bergen-Belsen. And in December of 1944, we were supposed to get on a train. My brother had had some surgery in Ravensbrück. And remember, there was a full working hospital there. He had a wound on his neck, which had not healed completely. And before we got on the train, my mother refused to move until she could bandage his neck. We were sent back to the barracks that we had been in, followed by 2 officers, one a woman, one a man, and a dog, a large dog. I remember the dog as a German Shepherd. My brother remembers it as a Weimaraner. We both remember the dog. The woman pulled out her gun, ready to shoot us, and the man, the officer, said, "Don't bother. We'll get them next time." And they did. We were shipped off to Belsen. I want to give you a little bit of history of Bergen-Belsen. It was originally a German army training post. It became a prisoner of war camp with the purpose of holding prisoners for exchange with the Allies. And after a while, it became another concentration camp. And by the time we got there, essentially the guards were disappearing and no food was handed out. Everybody was on his or her own. Again, another remembered different point. I had typhus. There was a terrible typhus epidemic at that time. And either my mother or brother had typhus. I don't know which one. My brother remembers that it was our mother. And, I'm not that sure, but it's certainly a very minor difference. On April 15th, 1945, my brother and I stood at a wire fence just outside of the camp, and we saw soldiers, not German, tanks, not German, and some German guards whom we had seen walking with their hands on top of their heads. The British had come. Within a week after the British had come, another 20,000 people died who were in the concentration camp. There are some horrific films of dead inmates being thrown into a common open grave by the German guards. There was also a film taken by the British soldiers. And the film was released in 1995. My brother and I might have been in that film. However, the film was not taken immediately after the liberation of Belsen. I know that it was taken months later. I know that we were in a film, whether it's that one that you can see at the Holocaust Museum or not, I just don't know. Sergeant Seegers wrote a wonderful letter to the cousin of my mother. And the first sentence is, of course, wonderful. Jack Weinstock, prior to our incarceration, had promised that he would take us in if we could get to the United States. A very important thing. However, this was not the first document that the Weinstocks received. The first one was a letter written by my mother, which starts, I don't remember your address, I hope it gets to you, in German, of course. And the address that she wrote was Jack Weinstock, Atlanta, Georgia. And it got to him. He was married to the first cousin of my mother, who was his second wife. His first wife was a sister of the second wife, who died during the flu epidemic. And of course, Jack Weinstock asked that the next sister be sent to him, which is what happened. When we were released from Belsen, we had all kinds of documentation. And this you can clearly see is a passport. The best thing about it is that my mother lied about her age. She was born in 1906, not 1907. Being born in 1907 did not make her, for 1946, a 40-year-old widow. So I can understand this change of age. This is my passport. And obviously, this is a picture of me. The most interesting thing about it is that I never knew this, that I was a former political prisoner. And if you look at this page, you can see a background of bars or a fence and an horrific, ghostly face. These particular passports are extremely rare, but fortunately, I still have mine. This is my mother, my brother, and me after the war. And this is a picture of the Jewish community of Nuremberg sometime after the war. Here I am, and my brother. My mother is over here. And this man became my stepfather. He had been in the Soviet army for at least 4 years. And at the end of the war, somewhere in Czechoslovakia, he deserted. He walked away from a train, made his way all the way back to Nuremberg, and knocked on the door of the Jewish Community Center. This person, Herbert Kolb, emigrated and wound up in New Jersey. He became a chicken farmer. He wrote a book about his experiences. In that book, he mentions finding my mother, my brother, and me after the war at Bergen-Belsen. The day he met us is one that just stands out with great clarity. He was on a search for his sister, who he had heard had been in Belsen. And he was allowed to ride a bicycle throughout a lot of Germany searching for his sister. He received a pass from some army person and just rode all around. He never found his sister. She had died in Belsen. We lived in Nuremberg in this house until 1946. We were then sent to a displaced person camp in Munich and then to Bremen. Getting a ride from Germany to the United States was not a trivial thing. Indeed, there were very few ships, and people had to wait and wait. This particular ship, the Marine Marlin, had been used by an American line, it was an American ship, to move people from Germany to South America. These were not Jews who were on that ship. These were people who paid a premium to be on that ship. President Truman stopped it. He made a declaration that that particular ship had to return to Germany with its cargo and be used for bringing survivors of concentration camps to the United States. It was the only sailing the ship had for that. But we were on it, and we arrived in the United States on January 24th, 1947. We started sailing on January 10th, so it was a very long crossing. The North Atlantic is not a great place to be in January. Unfortunately, my brother was quite ill when he got there. He had serious problems with his lungs, and indeed, we thought that we would not be able to enter the United States. We were sent to Ellis Island, and after a few weeks in Ellis Island, we were discharged, quite fortunately. And we were to go to cousin Jack Weinstock's place in Atlanta, Georgia. We didn't. We stayed in New York. There were some issues with money and other such, but we didn't stay together. And after we arrived in the United States, for the first time, we were separated. My mother was a live-in maid in Forest Hills in New York. My brother was sent to live with our Uncle Willie, the one who had left in 1933, had gone to Atlanta, and then wound up in West Palm Beach. And I lived with a cousin. So this was from early February to the end of May. And after that, we got back together. My mother and my stepfather, David, married, and we moved to an apartment on West 23rd Street in New York City. And we became a family. So the story, I think, can be summed up with three pictures. There were the four of us. We became three. And then we became four again. And here's where I'd like to read something else. This is something I wrote note to my parents. The second time my mother died, we buried her body in New Jersey. There must have been 30 of us to recite the cottage. 8 months later, the mound covered with pebbles and the caretaking for posterity paid for, we set a stone to mark the grave, never to return to it. The second time my father died, an oven belched the product of his body's combustion into the already foul air. Records were so well kept that the three of us in Ravensbrück were officially notified by carbon copy of the death certificate that he had died. The original went to the German town of Niederhofstadt, where the date of his death is recorded as the counterpoint of his date of birth. They died together the first time. Their bodies, not accepting or willing to hear the message, moved on. His, to become a host for deadly rickettsia, burning him while alive and on his way to the oven. She had us to nurture. There was not enough time to welcome the succor of death. When it came, it was no longer to be welcomed. Her world had become almost normal. Thank you.
Sam, thank you. That was just incredible. And I'm sure we've all been very moved by your presentation. I think that we're going to have questions now, and I'd like to open it up for questions. So let's have questions.
It has to leave such a lump in one's throat that it's hard to think of a question of the pain that your family and all other families had that is inhumane period of our society. So I have no question, basically, but it's thank God you're here, and the family that survived, and all families that survived. I hope we've learned a lesson, which I doubt, about what dictators do, and we can smell them around again and smell the anti-Semitism around. Maybe we should be more, that's the only takeaway. But thank you for the presentation.
Thank you for listening.
Bob?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Sam, it's hard to talk about what you went through because none of us can put ourselves in your shoes. Can you tell us a little bit about your history after you got to the United States, where you went to school and things like that? And
Sure. I'll start with high school. And that's because Henry Wexler and I share the same high school. And that was Stuyvesant High School in New York City. From there, I went to the same college that Jack Sobel went to, the City College of New York. And then Johns Hopkins, and then the University of Miami. Now, my brother, when he went to high school, he did what was expected of a young man in Europe coming from a middle-class family. He went to a vocational high school so he could get a job. And he learned how to become something very important, which he did not enter as a field, but probably would have been much wealthier had he done so, and that was refrigerator repair. He then trained himself to, went back to school, took courses, and became an engineer, a metallurgical engineer at the University of Missouri School of Mines. And he and I, you heard before in the introduction, both went into what I thought was the best helping profession we could go into, and that was teaching. He had a rough time of it. He taught middle school. I taught middle school, but the kids were older. They were college students. So that's where we were. Does that help, Bob?
It does, but when you mentioned Stuyvesant, it reminded me that when I asked my college admissions officer why more people, weren't taken from the New York, Brooklyn area, he said because they'd fill the whole class and we have to have diversity.
I understand it, and just to respond a little bit, New York State had a regents examination, and if you received a scholarship and went to a school in New York State, it was a very nice scholarship. However, students from 3 different schools, Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, and Brooklyn Poly, could not receive all of the scholarships, which is what the case would have been.
Yeah.
So I fortunately received one with a score that was considerably higher than scores people had in upstate New York, but only after I was on the waiting list. So yeah, it was wonderful. We had Henry and I have spoken, and I think that education was much more difficult than college. Certainly worked harder and learned more.
Sam has a
Thank
question.
you.
Sam?
Yes,
Hi, Sam.
Sam, thank you very much for sharing these unfortunate circumstances with us. It's important to have this done. Maybe not so much for us, but for the rest of the world, and I hope that you're doing that somehow. But I have two questions. One was how you felt in this new country. You were about, what, 5 years old?
8 when I came.
You were on 8. So you had to go to grade school and you didn't know English, I assume.
No, my brother and I actually were speaking English by the time we were on the ship. And there are several letters that attest to that. So we were translators on the ship. So I don't know how we picked it up so rapidly. Probably when we were, especially in Ravensbrück, you had to be able to get by in 4 or 5 languages just to survive a day.
Right.
So I think that was one of the things. But grade school was terrible because I was 8 years old and I was put into kindergarten.
Right, yeah.
And I peed my pants, I think the 3rd day, when I did not know how to bow in some kind of dance.
Oh boy. And how did the other kids treat you?
Most of them were perfectly indifferent to me, which is great. There were some who tried to beat me up. I have a couple of scars, one primarily from the edge of a can. Somebody said, you shouldn't have come here, you should have stayed where you were. So it was a normal childhood. Sometimes you got beaten up and sometimes you got home okay for lunch.
But you rapidly fit in, did very well. I'm curious also about, you said you returned to Germany. And I'm just curious about how your feelings are going back to some of these places, and how do you feel about Germany today?
I've been back to Germany several times, mostly because of my job at BU required me to be in various parts of Europe. I will not use the language that I would ordinarily use. I was terrified in Germany. I was certain that people were following me, listening to every word I said, and were able to see through the fly on my pants and fully understand that I was Jewish. Terrible, terrible time. The best time in Germany was in 2011 when Charlotte and I were there with my brother, and we were able to say goodbye to Germany. It was his first trip back. It was my truly last trip back. I always walked looking over my shoulder. Nothing personal. It's just because I was Jewish. It wasn't me. It was what I embodied, was the thought.
Right. Yeah, well,
So Sam, I need to tell you that my grandfather also was sent to the Isle of Man.
Ah,
So they came in 1939 from Frankfurt, and he had bad rheumatic heart disease, but still was sent there, and he survived and lived for I guess about 20 years after that. But your comment about your fear, when I was about, both my parents were from Germany, and they were married on the night that the Reichstag was burnt down. And then it took them several months to be able to get out of Germany. So even in 1933, it was difficult to get out.
yes.
And my mother was always very much against going back to Germany, but my father, he loved reading German books. He had books sent from Germany. And so when I was, I guess, about 10, we went to Germany for the first time. And I remember my sister and I, we were petrified. We locked the door of the bedroom and were very, very scared, even though I had an aunt who'd actually gone back to Germany after the war. They'd roamed over Europe through the war, and they lived there. But I know exactly, well, I don't know exactly what you're feeling, but I sort of felt it too, even though I only had it by memory as I was born in 45.
In Germany, I was certain people were following me.
Right.
If not physically, they were. There's no question in my mind that I didn't belong there. And I was truly a stranger in a very strange land. My brother and I both early on decided that we would forget German, that we would not speak it. So I don't anymore. I read it, but I don't speak it.
Linda?
But this was
Linda Weinstein?
this.
Yes. Actually, Sam asked a couple of the questions I was going to ask you, but I also wondered, was it difficult to talk to your children about your past? Did they ask questions, or did you just present what you thought they needed to know? So many of us have come from pasts where our parents, our families just never talked to us about, and we didn't know enough to ask.
I'm going to do something that might be a bit of a surprise. I'm going to ask first my son, and then two of the grandchildren I see. I don't know if Jeremy's here. He is, so he's on another screen. But here's my son.
Thank you for that question, a challenging one to answer because I think that, first of all, my name's Alan. I am the only son. It was a challenging topic. It's not something that we talked very much about. I would say we had very brief conversations when I was in middle school and high school, when my father did come to speak to several of my classes, and that would generate some discussion, but we never got into any great detail, I would say, until I was in college. And I took a specific course actually dealing with cancer. And I remember specifically reading Rabbi Harold Kirshner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And that really spurred me on to ask more questions and delve into my family's history a little bit more. And to me, that was a little bit more of a turning point in all of this. And I think as eloquently as my dad has spoken today, I know how challenging that it is. So I think sometimes I personally do hesitate to ask some of the questions because I know how hard it is.
I also see 3 grandchildren, but none of you has to say anything. Smart move.
So are there any other questions?
Yes.
I should go to the second screen just to make sure.
Yes, Michael.
Yes, Faye.
Yes. Sam, that was very moving, and I thank you very much for sharing your story with us. I'm wondering, when you came to the United States, you were telling about how the kids mistreated you in a way. I would like to know, was there anybody who helped you? Were there kind people? Were there groups? Did your mother and stepfather have a support system?
Thank you. I don't think I was more mistreated than any other kid growing up in the part of Manhattan where we lived. Everyone was beaten up by the bigger kids, and then the turn was taken. So there were several incidents, as I spoke about in the first place where I lived, where I clearly was picked on because I was Jewish, not because I had been in a concentration camp. I forgot what your other question was.
Whether there were people who helped you and whether
Oh,
your
of course.
parents had a support system.
There was a great deal of help available from, first of all, family. And I don't remember the names of the support systems, but we were not alone by any means at all. People were there and helped out as much as possible. So I have fond memories, except for the scar on my face, of growing up, and I tried my best to be an American athletic kid. I succeeded in 2 out of the 3, and I don't think that I suffered much more than any other kid growing up in New York City, except for the fact that I internalized everything. So that what might have been an ordinary scuff with someone else, to me, became an anti-Semitic move. It wasn't just because I was on the corner, it was me. The Jew shouldn't be on the corner.
Was there a group of survivors that banded together or not?
Yes. My mother, and I refer to my stepfather as my father. They belonged to several organizations and smaller groups Some of them knew each other from before the war. Most who were survivors, I would not call a survivor just because they left Germany prior to the war. But that's a fine point, and maybe even I'm being a little ridiculous when I try to be. I don't want to share my survivorship in that sense with someone who I don't think really survived.
So Peter's got a question.
He doesn't know my computer.
I was curious, Sam, when you were at BU, did you interact at all with Elie Wiesel?
He and I met weekly. For at least an hour. There was only one other person on campus with whom he shared time like that, and that was the Hillel rabbi, Joe Pollack, who claims that we knew each other in Belsen. I don't think we did, but he certainly was in Belsen. Yeah, I had some very nice times with Elie Wiesel.
Were there other survivors there at BU with you, or just you and Wiesel?
Right now, I can't think of some of them, but the answer is yes. There were, and for each of us, it's unique, but yet it's the same thing.
When you went to Europe with yours, did you go with students?
No.
Oh, so it wouldn't. Thank you.
Roz, you had a question.
That was just an amazing story, Sam. I've known you since you moved in, and you always seem to have a happy face, and I would never have understood what you have gone through. I don't know if I missed this because it was a long story. Did you come back by ship, and how long were you on it when you came back?
We came back by ship in the winter of 1947, and we ran into several storms in the North Atlantic. It was an outrageous trip. I was seasick for only one day. And I think my brother and I were the only ones who could have said that it was only one day for each of us.
How long did it take you to?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
So Sam, I was going to ask you, do you have any recollection of the British troops that liberated the camp?
Thank you for asking. I had a much different presentation all laid out, but as often happens, things change in the middle. First of all, we were liberated by British soldiers at Belsen. Some of the soldiers were from Israel. There was actually a large number of soldiers from Israel who treated my brother and me in a special way. When we were liberated, we were moved to the barracks that had been part of Belsen when it was a training camp, and there was a swimming pool. And I remember one of the Israeli soldiers throwing the two of us into the pool and clearly saying, if you want to get out of the pool, learn how to swim.
Wow.
We got out. The British soldiers were wonderful, really, really wonderful. And I remember riding the sidecar of a motorcycle. So I've just the fondest memories of that.
Bob, you had a comment.
A quick question. I had never heard about this President Truman changing the course of that ship. Could you expand that a little bit, Sam?
Well, I found out about this when I was doing some research. And I put the name of the ship into a search engine and then ran across the story. So that I can't expand on it because I think I told you everything that I know.
But Truman actually canceled a voyage of a,
Yes, that's, I can go to my notes that I have stored somewhere in a file, but that's how I remember it. But that was the only time the ship was used that way.
Sam Lehrer?
I have to unmute myself.
You are
You
on
are unmuted. You are unmuted.
Yes. Sam, a little bit more curious about your experience in Germany as an adult. Many survivors go back to Germany and have a different experience than apparently you did. And you do still, I think. When you went back to Germany, did you actually identify yourself as a Jew in your interactions with people? And have your feelings about Germany changed at all in view of all the positive things that they have done to try to reconcile the situation over the years?
In the city of Erlangen, there's a woman named Ilse Sponsel, who was a marvel. She invited us to visit the town. I fell in love with her. The magazine that you saw with the picture of my uncle and grandfather, she wrote the article. So she did everything possible to return good things to people. One of the questions, I guess, with the title I had, do I forgive Germans? Do I forgive Germany? I hate being there. I feel uneasy. People are following me. Other people want to go, that's fine. I don't hate Germans. I don't hate Germany. There are a few people who happen to have been Germans for whom I had absolutely no love. And so I don't think I can take out my emotion on a piece of land.
Right. Thank you.
So, Sam, that was just quite incredible. And I think I'm speaking for everybody when I thank you.
Thank you.
For this presentation and that you shared it with us. And I think it's very important. And I agree with you, we must never forget. And that's got nothing to do with forgiveness or anything else.
Right.
And I would also add that there were Germans who never participated.
Yes.
And who fought against the Nazis. And we know in the country right now, there are people who are anti-Semitic and there are other people that are definitely not. And I think that was true for Germany too.
Yes.
Any other questions? All right, well, I want to thank you, Jack. I want to thank you, Sam. I think we're off to a great start of doing these by Zoom and by 918, and appreciate everybody's participation. Thank you.